Hello and welcome back to the Interpreting Your Genetics Summit put on by the Evolution of Medicine. I'm your host, James Maskell, and you have joined us for a session called Epigenetic Mastery with Andrea Nakayama. Andrea is the founder of Replenish PDX and the Functional Nutrition Alliance, and we're absolutely thrilled to have her. She's been a frequent guest on the Evolution of Medicine podcast and on the Functional Forum, and is training the next generation of providers to understand functional medicine, functional nutrition, and how to create health for people. And so it's an absolute pleasure to have you here on the summit, Andrea. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here and particularly to talk about this topic.
Absolutely. So, obviously there's going to be a lot of conversation in this whole summit about epigenetics because, what we're really looking to do is how do we influence the genes that for resilience, and how do we turn on more of those and turn off as many as possible that contribute to disease. But I know that, you've been, thinking and educating about this, all kinds of providers, from nurses to physicians to health coaches to nutritionists for a long time. And maybe we could just start with sort of laying a context for epigenetics.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of the things that I think is really important for us to remember is that the conversation about genes right now is very sexy. And in that appeal is this desire to move to a one-size-fits-all approach based on one SNP, based on any biomarker. And we have to be really careful of that because each of those SNPs or alleles, those single nucleotide polymorphisms, exist in a terrain, in an environment. And when we shift that environment, when we back it up and shift the environment, that's when we shift the terrain in which that SNP actually expresses itself. So as I like to say to the practitioners I teach, the sum is greater than the parts. And I sort of have a top 10 list that I like to go through in presencing what I mean by that. Is it okay if I share those top 10?
Yeah, let's start with the top 10. Great stuff.
Great. So number one, I think it's really important that we know that human beings are 99.9% identical, that there is variation, but we're primarily the same. And mutations occur naturally. They're not a bad thing. They're just going to occur. If a mutation does occur, so this is number three. Number one is we're, mostly identical. Number two is they occur naturally. Number three is that if mutations do occur, they occur typically in meiosis, and then they will appear in every cell in the body. And the things that cause mutations to occur are going to be epigenetic factors in mom or dad, like smoking, stress, maternal age. We now even have data that shows that paternal age can affect these mutations. Number four is that these SNPs are small. There can be hundreds in every single person. I think the number that they're talking about is about 800 in the human body. So we all have them. They're occurring all the time. There's a lot of them, but not necessarily in comparison to the number of genes that we have. Number five, and this is really key, is that not all variations are deleterious. So most of these alleles, most of these variations exist or occur in a non-genetic region. So they may or may not affect an expressed protein. We just don't know. Number six is that variations that have large effects are actually really rare. So when we think of genetic conditions like we used to in our past, before we got to this age of the 23andMe, those are rare conditions. And the ones that have smaller effects that we're starting to talk about more often are more common. A lot more of us have them, like an MTHFR or a COMT, and they have a low probability of disease, except in an environment that triggers them into that expression. So that's number seven, that these variations have small effects. And I just want to say that when we talk about single nucleotide polymorphisms, polymorphism essentially means many forms. So that's what we're thinking about, many forms of a gene. Number 8 is when we look at testing, each individual SNP is analyzed separately from other SNPs. So that doesn't mean that because we have both SNPs that they mean anything in particular. Because number 9 is that the info can be contradictory. The information we get about having 2 genetic polymorphisms could be contradictory. One can say you need to take more omega-3s. One can say you shouldn't be taking omega-3s. So that information that we get in that testing, I like to think of it as wallpaper or a backdrop. Again, we're not following a one-size-fits-all approach based on the marker. We're looking at it as a possible truth for the person. So number 10 brings us back full circle that we cannot treat SNPs in isolation or in isolation of clinical findings. We have to look at the expressive genotype. So we have to look at who is this whole person, what's happening in their signs, their symptoms, their diagnosis, their history, their triggers, their mediators, and there's also these genetic pieces that I have knowledge about or that I have access to. How does that whole picture look, and where does that information fit into the whole? So those are the 10 things I like to present, because I think we're often, as patients, thinking that if we find out a truth about our genes, that we will know the treatment that will fix everything. And the truth is that those genes, we don't know if they're expressed or not, and we don't know what they mean about our treatment or care.
Absolutely. Well, that's such a great starting point for this conversation, and I really appreciate you breaking that down. So, you've called this session Epigenetic Mastery, and, from all the sessions that we've had in the summit, it's very clear that there's a potential for any of us, no matter what, how our genes have loaded the gun, to be able to express those genes in very different ways depending on the environment that we choose. So that sounds like epigenetic mastery to me. It sounds like, having really good control of the environment to be able to, help the healthiest expression of our genes. So what does it mean to be an epigenetic master, and how can we achieve epigenetic mastery?
Yeah, great. So there's a 3-tier approach that I've devised that allows people to start thinking into this. And the 3 tiers aren't easy tiers. There's a lot to do within each of these tiers, either alone as a patient or with a dedicated practitioner who may be thinking about these things in addition to looking at that genetic blueprint that you have. So tier number 1 is what I call the non-negotiables. Tier number 2 is deficiency to sufficiency. And tier number 3 is dismantling dysfunction. So we can look at what each of those means. And this is where we really get to start thinking of ourselves as individuals. And, there's so much that's individual about each one of us, which is really the beautiful thing about functional medicine, about functional nutrition, that we step back and we say, you are not your polymorphism. You are not your Hashimoto's. You are not your small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. You are you. And your microbiome is unique. Your genetic blueprint is unique. Your history is unique. How do we start to devise a system of care when there's that much that's varied between us? So this is why I developed the tiers, because it helps us in my clinic and me in teaching other clinicians around the globe to think into these really complex situations. So should we start with the non-negotiables?
I think we could start with that, but I guess I just want to reflect back, Andrea. I think one of the reasons why I appreciate, what you've brought is that, you've been able to organize the practice and the delivery of functional medicine, in a very easy and well thought out way. And, that's part of what's needed in order to take this to the masses is, how do we actually create structures where everyone can understand it, and the frameworks and stories that you create, really valuable. So I love this idea of the 3 sessions. So yeah, let's get into the non-negotiables.
Yeah, so this is a great way that I like to present things for both patients and practitioners. And oftentimes we're using this language like, have you discovered the person's non negotiables? You know your non negotiables. And some of the non negotiables are in the basic realm. You know, in functional medicine, we're always looking at inflammation, oxidative stress, blood sugar balance. Those become non negotiables. But what that means for each individual is different. Why or what somebody's eating or what they're exposed to in their environment, emotional environment or situational environment that's causing inflammation or oxidative stress is going to be different. And we start to uncover what are the non-negotiables for you. And in my clinic, we won't even bring somebody into one-on-one counseling, one-on-one nutrition counseling, unless they have already removed refined sugar, gluten, and dairy. So we have a program that helps people understand why, but then that allows us to go to the next step of non-negotiables. So we want to be sleeping well and making sure that we're getting good sleep, not just in hours, but in quality. We want to be pooping well, making sure that we're not constipated or losing too many nutrients through our elimination. We want to be hydrating, and we want to be eating the diet that is appropriate for our needs. So uncovering your non-negotiables may be something as a patient that you can do on your own to a point. And then you may need some support to help you determine what are your particular non-negotiables. And when I talk about this, James, it's not just our non-negotiables for health in terms of like being perfect. It's also our non-negotiables in the social realm, with our cultural heritage, appropriate for our genetics. So we have to discover, what do I need to be in my best health? Do I need to go to sleep by 10, whereas you might need to be out with friends? Can I eat eggs? I can't, but you can, and they're beneficial for you. How do we uncover what are the non-negotiables that are impacting your body, your terrain at every level? So to me, the non-negotiables is a place that we spend a lot of time that's often rushed through or given a nod to, but it's many factors about our diet and our lifestyle that are impacting the inside in which those genes can express or not express.
So, what are some of the lifestyle things outside of the diet things that are non-negotiables?
Well, definitely sleep and, spiritual connections, which can mean whatever you want that to mean. It just means a connection that's deeper than you. That might be to community, to belonging, to being in nature. I often like to think about what is it I love doing that feeds me? I'm somebody who loves story podcasts. I love hearing different stories about different people's lives. It helps me understand humanity. And I need to make sure I carve out the time to feed that part of myself. I need sleep. I have a non-negotiable of going to sleep at 10:30. Of course, there's going to be circumstances where in a risk-reward situation, the reward of staying up later is greater than the risk of going to sleep at 10. And I will make that choice knowing that I'm making that choice. So I'm aware of my non-negotiables. So our non-negotiables are unique for each of us. And I'm really a proponent of, double clicking on that area and saying, am I actually in touch with all my non-negotiables? In the functional medicine model, these are essentially our mediators. What helps me feel better? What makes me feel worse? And how do I get more in touch with those so that I'm more aligned with feeling better than worse? When we feel that, and when we're living and in tune with our non-negotiables, you can bet that there is a different environment in which your genes are bathed and exist.
So, whatever your genetics says, these are epigenetic non-negotiables to be able to, create health in everyone.
Exactly. And they're different for every single person. There might be some basics that we start with, the top inflammatory foods, getting good sleep, making sure you're eliminating and hydrating. There may be some basics that we look at, but again, they're going to mean different things for different people. Great example of that was a study that came out of Israel a few years ago that showed that we can't just look at the glycemic load for what affects blood sugar in different individuals, that ice cream is going to affect one person differently than another. A banana is going to affect one person differently than another. So the more we dive into our non-negotiables, and this is a huge part of where I spend time with people, in that tracking, that identifying, that sort of double click on this part, because this is where you as a patient have the most control over that genetic expression and everything else.
So essentially, this first process is almost like an internal knowing of yourself, getting to know how certain foods and lifestyle factors affect you particularly, and getting comfortable with that and getting enough data in there to really know and not just think.
Absolutely. That's what it's all about for me, is that self-awareness. When we bring that self-awareness to our health picture, we not only empower our entire health outcome and our health team, but we as patients are empowered to actually sit back in the driver's seat, take over, instead of handing over our care to another pill, another protocol, another practitioner. We're actually back in the hero's journey ourselves as patients. So you said it beautifully. It's all about self-awareness. And, James, I think it's really interesting that we live in a culture that's all about individuality. I like to say, we want our bras in half sizes and our beds that are contoured to our bodies and the jeans that fit just right and our Spotify accounts that notice what we like and don't like. But it's harder for us as patients to stop and think about how personalized our self-care needs to be. And I'm a real stand for the truth of that, not just in our medical model, but for us as individuals.
Beautiful. And, just before we go on to the second tier, just a word towards, there are probably people, obviously people who are coming into your clinic are sick and they're looking for care. They have some sort of issue that they're trying to deal with. I'm sure there are going to be people who are listening to this who, have a certain degree of epigenetic mastery, or have just, through luck or youth, been able to avoid sickness so far. What do you recommend for people who, do you feel it's as equally a valuable as process to go through if you're well and then if you're sick?
I believe it does, but the truth is, James, we often need a motivating factor. We need something to motivate us to take the time to do the work. And what I'm talking about, it's not so sexy because it's work. And I think we do live in a culture where we want a quick fix. And this isn't a quick fix. This is about the journey. This is really about, if we think about it in terms of mindfulness or enlightenment, I'm basically talking about the kind of process of not navel gazing, but paying attention and being observant with your body and your diet and your lifestyle in a way that makes a difference. And I can totally understand that somebody who's not sick has no patience to take that time. There usually is something, just like there is in a mindfulness practice, that wakes us up to wanting that deeper self-knowledge. So I think it is important. Personally, I think it is important. And I think that it's probably a harder thing for somebody to do who's not motivated by a need to change their life or to feel better.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes it does take that interaction with sickness to, to take it to the next level. But this is the whole point, of this summit is that, sometimes the genetic information itself, going through the process can be a motivator. And we want to look for any of those opportunities that don't relate to an extreme illness to be able to empower, the community forward so that we can take pressure off the health system and we can keep more people, out of the doctor's office and contributing to society in a full way. So I appreciate you sharing that. And, that seems like a great starting point for tier one. What's in the second tier?
Tier two is what I like to call deficiency to sufficiency. And I just want to say that it doesn't mean that we're not working on two tiers at the same time, especially in our clinic. We are often having to work on two tiers at the same time. But the first tier is really empowering for the patient, and it's something that only they're going to know better. That they're going to know it better than anyone else. And I should say we, because I'm a patient too. I have Hashimoto's. I'm always paying attention to what's going on with my body, seeing if I eat something, does it make my joints hurt, or what comes up for me. So tier two, deficiency to sufficiency, is a really interesting one, especially in our culture these days, because there are so many deficiencies. I think that the CDC did a survey a couple of years ago, looking at the serum and maybe even the urine of millions of individuals, and there were millions of different key deficiencies. And I'm talking about nutrient deficiencies and what they looked at: magnesium, essential fats. There's huge deficiencies that are implicated in different disease states. So if we think about this through the functional medicine perspective, and we think about upstream versus downstream, we can easily see that an essential fat deficiency is a higher risk factor for heart disease downstream, right? So we can look at that with magnesium, which is implicated in over 300 enzymatic functions in the body. That becomes an upstream factor for a lot of downstream deficiencies. It's a contributing factor. It's part of the terrain. Now, our soil is deficient, so we as individuals are more deficient in a lot of minerals. And we're not just deficient in nutrients like vitamin D or those essential fats or zinc or magnesium. We're also deficient in certain things that should be occurring naturally in our body, like secretions. So a lot of Americans, especially as we age, are deficient in stomach acid. We produce less stomach acid as we age. That becomes a deficiency that we want to take to sufficiency. That deficiency in and of itself can cause further deficiencies in our iron levels and in our B12 levels that physiologically are occurring because of the hydrochloric acid deficiency, the stomach acid deficiency. So we need to understand physiology enough, at least as practitioners, to help an individual identify their deficiencies, because it's very hard for the body to heal in a state of deficiency. Another example, James, would be if we're dealing with adrenal issues. Is there a deficiency in hormones of any sort, whether those are corticosteroids, whether those are progesterone, estrogen, testosterone, DHEA? If there's a deficiency that we haven't identified, it's very, very hard for us to go to those, let's say, infection protocols or dealing with a gene and whether it's expressing or not, because the environment is already out of balance. It's already out of its homeodynamic state. So these are the things that I like to think about in the realm of deficiency to sufficiency. And just one extra thing, when we think about certain medications people take, we have to look at where they're causing deficiencies. Birth control alone can cause deficiencies in certain B vitamins. Metformin, which more Americans are taking for diabetes, can also cause certain B12 deficiencies. These are creating a terrain in which more of those genes can express themselves negatively.
I think that's a great point. And talking about, nutrition and nutrient deficiencies. And for anyone who's listening, if you want to pause the recording and go over to mitavin.com, my friend Dr. Jeffrey Glad, who's also going to be on this summit, created this. You can go to www.mitavin.com, put in all of the pharmaceuticals that you've taken, and what it ends up spitting out is the nutrient deficiencies associated with those medications, and then the symptoms that are associated with those nutrient deficiencies. And, this has been actually a very powerful tool for many, many practitioners to use with their patients to help them to see, how the environment has led to deficiencies, and that environment being nonstop use of pharmaceutical agents. So once you've done that, you can take a look in that. Hopefully that's a useful addition to this conversation. And Andrea, I really appreciate you bringing that up. It seems like the length of time that it would take for tier 2 would be a function of the size of the deficiency. Is that right?
Absolutely. And what we have access to looking at. So we can base some of those deficiencies, we can work off of signs, symptoms, assumptions based on diagnoses. Some of those deficiencies we can, identify on our own as patients. Other deficiencies, we may need help. We may need a practitioner to help us look for what is deficient here. Where do I need to be considering this? And this is where a functional lens really does come into play, because we're looking at what does it take for the body to be fully functional versus where is the body in a disease state, right? So I've seen labs for people where, the doctor comes back and says, oh, this 15-year-old girl who is bleeding is not anemic, and it's because those labs are in a pathological range, and yet functionally they're so low that it's a crime that they're not being addressed. So we really do here need to look through a functional lens at where somebody might be experiencing deficiencies and where those deficiencies are impeding their ability to get better.
Awesome. Well, that's the first 2 out the way. So what's level 3?
Level 3 is dismantling the dysfunction. And this is, again, where I see a lot of us running right to the dysfunction. We go right to the diagnosis or the infection or the single nucleotide polymorphism or the biomarker, and we forget to look at the terrain in which that dysfunction exists. So, as Dr. Jeffrey Bland says, disease starts with dysfunction, and yet we have to look at all the triggers, the precipitating events, all the things that lead to the appearance of a dysfunction. What does a dysfunction actually mean? And we have to remember that a dysfunction exists in a terrain that's physiological, physical, cognitive, psychological, spiritual, which is for me why this functional approach, this functional nutrition approach, allows us to step back and consider all those factors. So we kind of shift the soup in which that infection exists. And I like to say that in dismantling the dysfunction, we may have done the work of dismantling it if we level the playing field with those other factors that we've tended to in tier 1 and tier 2. So we might actually dismantle the dysfunction without having to go to the big guns, the infection protocols, either the antibiotics or the agents that we might use to address an infection of some sort, like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth or like Candida or like E. coli. How do we shift the environment? Because the body is actually meant to be able to dismantle the dysfunction. That dysfunction does exist in an environment. So for me, it really is a systems biology approach in that we're looking at the system before we just look at going to the infection. And it is tier number 3 because sometimes we do need to go there. We do need to look at what do we need to do to actually address this condition in the body, this diagnosed condition.
Absolutely. So it sounds like, where, that's the time when you're getting into connection with a practitioner to be able to look at the underlying causes, look where the dysfunction is happening, look what the causes are of that dysfunction, and taking an approach that's a lot more laser focused.
Yeah, I mean, that's where we might need things that are prescribed or definitely done only under the purview of a practitioner who can, let's say, work with antimicrobials, whether they're herbals or pharmaceuticals. This is where we definitely need help. We can't dismantle the dysfunction on our own. And this is where we might need multi-tiered support as well, because we see a lot of people in our clinic where their physician is going to tier 3 so quickly, and it's the right thing to do. They need to be at that tier 3, that infection needs to be addressed, but their body can't even tolerate the treatment protocol. And so how do we get the body ready to be able to dismantle the dysfunction is a really key part of this. And I think this is the trouble we get to when we think about things through the lens of the infection or the allele alone. We could get ourselves into trouble because we want to first and foremost be thinking about, what are my non-negotiables? Because that's where I actually have power. And have I addressed my deficiencies? And then, is there anything else I really need to be doing? So in terms of empowering the patient from a genetic realm, even if we find out we have the gene for Alzheimer's or breast cancer, you shift the terrain, you shift the probability of disease expression.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to just, follow up on something you said earlier, which is that, all of these things are looked at in isolation. And, obviously what we're moving towards generally in medicine is away from sort of like a single cause, single effect approach to medicine and more of a systemic systems biology approach. And maybe you could just talk into a little bit about how to view the SNPs and these kind of issues in that context, because it seems to me that if you take that approach to looking at things in that context, then each individual thing by itself is not so important. Because I guess what I'm really trying to do with this summit is to provide people who are interested in genomics with great information about how they can make changes, but also a sense of real responsibility about doing the right thing with this information and not allowing it to become something that leads to fear or otherwise, right?
Yeah, I'm so glad that this conversation is happening, and I'm so glad we know this. Like, this is really brilliant information for us to be able to dive into and be aware of. And I'm a huge fan of the work of what's his name, the guy who wrote The Gene.
Siddhartha Mukherjee.
Yes, Siddhartha Mukherjee. Thank you. I think that his work in writing about the gene is really, really important for us to understand that even when we look at, let's say, 2 breast cancers, that they can express differently genetically. And that difference in their genetic expression actually does help to inform the treatment of that cancer. So just because the cancer cells are in 2 people that may otherwise be the same age, the same height, the same weight, that just because the cancers are in their breasts doesn't mean that those cancer cells are genetically the same. So we have to shift our thinking about how we treat disease based on understanding more information about the genes. That is critical. And to know that that's where science is going is really key, so that we're not just treating everything the same based on its name. But on the other side, on the flip side of that, we as patients cannot be looking at the minutia so much that we are basing our own self-care on that information alone. Again, the sum is greater than the parts. Yes, if we find out that we have an MTHFR polymorphism, we may need to be looking at where we get our forms of methylated folate. But not any two people may react the same way to dosages. This is where we have to think about an orthomolecular approach. What's the right dose for you? And in what environment does your MTHFR polymorphism exist that enables or doesn't enable you to take things at a certain dosage? Right? So there's a lot of things that happen in medicine these days where somebody finds out they have a gene and they just dose it the same. We find that we really have to back up. There's some people who can't tolerate even a microdose of something, and we call it start low, go slow, because somebody may be reacting to what's thought to be the quote unquote remedy for that situation. So this is where we really do need to, as individuals, be empowered to not think that there's a one-size-fits-all approach, but to understand, hey, my MTHFR polymorphism exists in my body, where personally my liver functions pretty darn well, and I'm able to take these nutrients to address the deficiencies that are going to occur from that polymorphism. Another person, many of the people we see, cannot dose their methylated folate or their B vitamins the same way I can because of a number of other factors. What we have to do, and this speaks to what you were asking about, in my opinion, James, is listen in, pay attention. If we're just working with the quote unquote prescription for that genetic defect, we may be missing the mark of listening in to what actually works for us and our body. It may take time to get to that dosing. Your body may never work with that dosing, and we need to be more in tune with what's going on for ourselves than we are with what the solution is for X. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a much more well-rounded approach. So I don't get the feeling from you that you would be encouraging anyone to, take serious measures to themselves based on an SNP or on a gene mutation.
No, I think that those non-negotiables are first and foremost. And you'll notice anytime I'm interviewed, any summit, any podcast, I barely ever give protocol-based recommendations, because I've seen with the thousands of people that we've worked with that rarely works. And I don't want to be responsible for telling somebody that they're supposed to take 500 milligrams of magnesium and then be responsible for what happens when they do, because we're each going to respond differently to that. So I do not think that protocol works. And that's because we are each so different. We're so bio-individual. And that includes our genes, our genetic blueprint, and the expression of that blueprint, which exists in an environment that's inside of our bodies, that has a microbial connection. There's all sorts of omics that we're looking at that interact together. There's a web of interactions. And I think that's really critical for us as people trying to care for ourselves to know. And the best thing we could do is back up and tend to our non-negotiables.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's great advice for everyone who's listening to this as a starting point to, be able to just get a baseline of what you can do and what you can't do, and how, certain nutrients, drugs, and other things interact with you. I want to take a little moment just to talk for everyone who's listening about how to do what you're talking about at the lowest possible cost. Because obviously you and I are both in the game of trying to improve and increase the number of providers trained in functional medicine and functional nutrition to take on this onslaught of disease, right? There's this massive onslaught of chronic disease, and you and I have been working in tandem to try and, get more practitioners trained in this. So there are some parts of your tiered system that really have to be delivered by a practitioner or in a relationship with a practitioner, particularly maybe the third and the second and third one, interpreting labs, going through the functional medicine intake, really starting to get what your case is reflected back by a professional. But clearly, if we want to reduce healthcare costs, there are people out there who can do most of it themselves, because ultimately when you're in a functional medicine relationship, ultimately you go into it, you get some insight and you get some empowerment and support from the practitioner, but ultimately it's kind of back on your shoulders to do the work. And so I would love to just talk about, for a moment here before we finish, for those people who are listening and say, look, I'd love to do this, but I can't afford to see a practitioner right now. I do have my 23andMe, or I don't have my 23andMe, and I'm just looking to, do the most rational things every day so that I can live a long and healthy life and not have these, diseases pop up. What do you say to those kind of people, and what can they do to essentially get the maximum benefit for the least possible cost?
Yeah, I love this question. And of course, I have three answers.
Doesn't surprise me.
Because I think there's a lot we can do. And there's a word I'm going to use that I'm sometimes told is a dirty word, because we do want quick fixes and we want the thing really fast that's going to make all the difference. And the three things that I think are important are all trackers. I think we can track. I think that when we step back and we collect data on ourselves, we gain a whole lot of information. So I have three trackers that I share with anybody who wants to come into our clinical services or is considering it. And you know what, James? I don't care if they use them for working with us or use them for working with another practitioner. I see them as gifts that I want to give to every single patient to say, hey, slow down and track for a minute. So the first tracker is a food, mood, poop tracker. And people hate to track because they think like, oh, I don't want to write everything down. But if you just do it objectively, I'm not looking ever for measurements. I'm not looking for anything other than write down what you ate, write down when you poop and what it looks like in a sort of Bristol stool chart sort of way. And write down, I put mood in quotations because it's really any sign, symptom, or diagnosis. Any sign or symptom that might come up based on any time of the day. So you're not looking for, oh, I ate that, I feel happy, but you are looking for when in the day do these different things happen? When in the day did I eat? When in the day did I poop? And what did it look like? When in the day did I feel pain, nausea, fatigue? And you write that down objectively without doing any belly button staring. You're just capturing information objectively. And you can then stand back and go back with colored pencils and circle, how many colors did I eat in that day? Am I getting a wide array of colors? When did I feel that symptom? What did I eat prior, or did I eat prior? We can start to be our own diagnostician when we capture information. And really, I think we get seduced by all the different kinds of testing that can be done and feel like there's an impediment when we can't do that testing. And I like to say, what you leave in the bowl, your poop, is your best diagnostic tool. It tells you a lot about what's going on in your body.
Yeah, no, I really love that. And I think it's just something that's so accessible to everyone, and it's such a good upstream indicator of everything that's going on.
Exactly. And the second, I know we don't have a lot of time, the second tracker is supplement tracker. I think a lot of people are taking vitamins, nutrients that they were told to take. They don't even remember where or by whom or on what summit. And they're taking things and they don't even know if it's helping them. Or they're not taking things religiously. On the other flip side of the coin, they're taking it periodically and it may not be helping them. We actually need to take those nutrients if we do need the support from them. So a supplement tracker allows us to slow down, analyze what we're taking, write it down. When did we start taking it? Did we notice a difference? Why were we advised to take that and by whom? And we capture that information. We then have it and we can take a look at it and we can take it to any practitioner that we're seeing. It's there. And the third tracker is a lab tracker. And I'm a big fan of people just writing down their labs in a tracker, keeping sort of a spreadsheet, even if you don't know what they mean. Each time you get your serum labs drawn, you just write them down so that you can see trends for yourself and ask questions of any practitioner you're working with. Why did that change so much between last year and this year? Is this something I should be concerned about? It just gives you a tool to capture information about yourself so that when you go forward, you not only have that information to be able to communicate better to your practitioners, but you start to ask questions yourself about yourself instead of just handing over your care to the person that you're seeing.
Beautiful. Well, Andrea, thank you so much for sharing everything. You know, I want to just say I really appreciate the way that you lay everything out. I think it's super accessible for everyone who's listening. And you're here listening to the Interpreting Your Genetics Summit. And what a great way to interpret your genetics, to know that whatever they look at, whatever, comes up, those 10 points that you made at the beginning and the 3 levels give everyone an opportunity to interpret their genes in a way that is empowering and is proven and will give you significant improvement in quality and quantity of life. So this has been a great session. If you want to find out more about Andrea's work, what's the best website to go to, Andrea?
Well, I do have my 3 tiers to Epigenetic Mastery for anybody listening, and you can get that at goevomed.com/mastery. That's a great way to get your hands and, really sink into those 3 tiers a little bit more. And then please do visit us at replenishpdx.com.
Beautiful. Well, this has been the Interpreting Your Genetics Summit. I'm your host, James Maskell. This is brought to you by the Evolution of Medicine. Thank you, Andrea Nakayama, for being part of the summit. And thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Make sure to tune in to some more sessions during the summit. And thanks so much for listening.